Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Finance Committee meeting of April 25th, 2024. At this point, we're going to call the meeting to order. We do have a quorum, but we are waiting for one of our members who's just stuck in traffic and should be here shortly. So we'll start by reading the land acknowledgement. Grimsby is situated on treaty land. This land is steeped in the rich history of the First Nations, such as the Hattaway-Wendourong, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. There are many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people from across Turtle Island that live and work in Niagara today. The regional municipality and the town of Grimsby stand with all Indigenous people, past and present, in promoting the wise stewardship of the lands on which we live. Item 3 on our agenda is disclosure of interest, and so for those who are here, are there any disclosures of pecuniary or non-pecuniary interest? Mayor Thompson? Sorry.
Member. Wow. I think Mayor Jordan would be.
A Freudian slip.
Katie, is this the time to Yeah. Yeah, I just want to declare a conflict of interest with FN 2412.
Thank you. That would be...
Item 7.2.
Thank you. That is so noted. Then we will move on to item 4, which is the approval of the agenda. But before we even do so, I would just like to take a moment to welcome our new town treasurer, Tony Delmonico, to the meeting this evening. Tony started with us on Monday, so I'm sure he's hoping we're not going to ask him anything too hard other than to welcome you here. We're looking forward to working with you, Tony. Tony comes to us from the city of Hamilton, most recently from the Hamilton Public Library, so he comes with municipal experience as well, and we are looking forward to working with you, Tony. Welcome.
Thank you for the warm welcome. I look forward to working with everyone here too.
Then I will move on and ask for a mover and seconder to approve our agenda this evening. Would someone like to make that motion? Councillor Vardy and Councillor Howe will second it. So resolved that the April 25th, 2024 Finance Committee agenda be approved. All those in favor, please raise your hand. Thank you. That is carried. Item 5 on our agenda is the receipt of the previous minutes. And if I could have a mover and seconder to receive those minutes. Councillor Howe has moved that. Councillor Vardy is seconding that. Are there any questions about any of the minutes? Then resolved that the following minutes be received. The Grimsby Economic Development Advisory Committee meeting of February 1st, 2024. The Finance Committee minutes of March 28th, 2024. And the Grimsby Economic Development Advisory Committee minutes of April 4th, 2024. And at the last meeting of March 28th, I believe it was after that, we had noted a small wording error on there, which I can say was adjusted before I did sign them. That was an administrative adjustment. So just to share with the committee members, that was taken into account. So if I could ask for a show of hands on all those in favor of receiving the minutes. And that is carried. Then we will move on to item 6 on the agenda, which is a delegation. And so this evening we have some representatives from HEMSN here who will be presenting to us the Community Benefits Charges Strategy and Bylaw. So welcome.
Great, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. My name is Jacqueline Hall and I'm a consultant at HEMSN. I've been working with a number of your staff on the CBC strategy. And as you mentioned, I'm here to just provide a bit of an update as to what we've been doing over the past several months. If we go to the next slide, I do have a bit of an agenda. Over the next 10 minutes or so, I'd like to just talk a little bit about what CBCs are. They are a new revenue tool for municipalities here in Ontario. So provide a bit of the legislative context, how we're actually able to bring forward a CBC bylaw. One of the key inputs to the CBC strategy, very similar to development charges, is that we are required to undertake a development forecast. And so we have prepared a forecast as part of this work as well. We've had some really good dialogue with planning staff. And so we'll talk about the number of units that we think would be eligible for CBCs over the next 10 years. We've also met with a number of departments to develop what we're calling a CBC capital program. It's a series of different services that we've identified, and so we've done some really great work. Staff have been excellent in helping us create a project list that we think is fair and reasonable, and so I'll talk a little bit about that. One of the important things about CBCs is also talking about, well, how much money do we think we're actually going to make from this new revenue tool? Bit of a spoiler alert, it's not as much as what municipalities originally hoped for under the legislation. So I'll walk you through that, and we'll talk about that a little bit further. And I will just say as well, despite that comment I just made, we still feel that it is an important tool for Grimsby to explore, particularly given that there are limitations to development charges and parkland dedication fees. And so really any additional revenue source we can look at is quite important to bring forward for consideration of council. And then we'll wrap up with next steps. So if we go to the next slide, I alluded to this a little bit when I was just talking about the agenda, but there is a new framework for funding growth-related capital here in Ontario. Over the last several years, I think we all have a bit of whiplash from all of the legislative changes that have happened. But some of it's been good and some of it's been a little bit challenging, but nonetheless, we're here today. So really municipalities have 3 revenue tools that they can use in order to fund what I call growth-related capital. So that has to be the initial round of infrastructure. This cannot be used to fund things like asset management, repair and replacement. This is really limited to new infrastructure that's being constructed in the town or infrastructure that's being redeveloped in order to create additional capacity to service for future growth. So development charges, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, being on the Finance Committee. They're used to also fund the initial round of growth-related infrastructure. However, there's been a lot of changes to the Development Charges Act in recent years. The list of eligible services has been stripped down and changed. And so as a result, some of those services that we used to fund from DCs are now being put on the back of community benefits charges, or CBCs. With respect to the CBCs itself, I'll get into this in a couple of slides, but it is very similar in the sense that we are, once again, only looking at that growth-related infrastructure. However, it's a very limited revenue tool intended to effectively charge high-density development. We also have parkland acquisition. That's a very important tool for municipalities. It allows for parkland dedication at a standard rate for 5% for residential, 2% for non-residential. There are alternative rates that are permitted as well. However, Bill 23 did cap what the alternative parkland rates can be, so that's now limited. And of course, we can also collect cash in lieu. All of these tools are appealable to the Ontario Land Tribunal. I will say we've now had a few decisions come out with respect to CBCs, the City of Mississauga and the City of Toronto being 2 of them, and the decisions have been quite positive for municipalities, so that's a bit of a good news story. So we go to the next slide. So a little bit of context to what the heck CBCs are. So originally, the Planning Act, and some of you might be familiar with this because the town did use this tool for quite some time. Under Section 37, there was something called heightened density bonusing. The development industry really didn't like it. They didn't feel it was transparent. I think some municipalities also thought it was somewhat challenging in some respects because there's a bunch of negotiations that happened. And so the government said, okay, we're going to do away with Section 37 and we're going to replace it with CBCs. They're very similar to Section 37 in that we can permit in-kind contributions. Interestingly, once we pass a CBC bylaw, it doesn't expire. So unlike development charges, where we're on this ongoing cycle of doing multiple studies and we're bringing forward new bylaws all the time, the bylaw never expires, which is great. However, it has to be reviewed every 5 years. What that means, or what we're interpreting the legislation to mean, because it's quite vague, is that you could likely just bring forward a report to council saying we've reviewed the strategy, the projects are still reasonable, the groupings of services are still reasonable, therefore the bylaw still stands. We would recommend that that review happen in tandem with your DC study, and I'll get into that in a couple of slides. But it's a much less prescriptive process than the development charges, which I think works to a municipality's benefit. Next slide. Okay, so CBCs can only be charged by single-tier or lower-tier municipalities, and they're very limited, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, because it can only be applied against higher-density development. And higher-density development is defined in the Planning Act as 5 or more stories or 10 or more residential units. So it has to hit both of those qualifiers. The legislation requires us to prepare a strategy, which we're working on right now. So it looks very similar to your DC background study. Interestingly, the legislation does not prescribe how we structure a rate. Most commonly, municipalities are using a percentage of land value because the regulation says you cannot exceed 4% of the value of the land the day before the building permit is issued. So effectively, the legislation has capped what municipalities can recover through CBCs. Of course, we're open to exploring other options. We could look at per unit rates, per square footage, or net hectare approaches. Very few municipalities have done that. The overwhelming majority have used the 4% of land value approach. In some municipalities where we've explored the per unit, the town of Innisfil being one we recently did, it was appealed by the development industry, even though it was done as a way to help come to some sort of resolution on some issues that they were having. So nonetheless, 4% of the land value seems to be working for a number of municipalities, and that is what we're recommending for the town as part of this process. Next slide. As I mentioned, CBC is limited to growth-related infrastructure. The legislation requires us to meet a nexus test, meaning that the capital infrastructure we identify in the strategy has to be related to the CBC eligible development. So 5 or more stories with 10 or more residential units. We've worked with staff to develop a number of categories for the purposes of the CBC strategy. Those categories include growth-related studies, parking services, which are no longer DC eligible, roads, bridges, and active transportation, which is often driven, especially the active transportation side, by higher density development because we're asking people to drive less, take cycling or walking, different modes of transportation. The administration of the program itself, including appraisals, we have included those in our capital program. Fire services, which is a DC eligible service, we've also looked at that for the purposes of the CBC strategy, recognizing that because of the funding envelope limitations of the Development Charges Act, there's a significant amount of costs associated with Fire Station 3 that the town is not currently funding through DCs. So we thought it was appropriate to bring in some of those costs related to Fire Station 3 into the CBC strategy should council decide to allocate the funds to that particular service. We've also included costs associated with parkland, park development, and community facilities. That's largely stemming from some of the parkland standards that have been identified in the master plans. Also recognizing that there's pressure on community facilities right now, and the town's likely going to be looking to build more of those in the future. Public art, heritage, and culture, those are services that are not eligible for development charges, so we have brought them forward as part of the CBCs. Top of mind for a lot of municipalities, and I know the town's working on their official plan right now, so certainly climate change initiatives, as we've understood through our discussions with staff, that's a fairly important area and something that might be an area in which funding could be applied in the future. Affordable housing as well. We recognize that that's largely a regional responsibility. We've recently done CBC strategies for Fort Erie and Niagara Falls, and we've included provisions for affordable housing within those strategies as well, recognizing that as those agreements change or are struck, and we were also working within a very interesting time with provincial legislation, something could change in the future and the town might want to contribute towards that. So we put in a provision for that as well. Next slide. Just the schematic on the slide essentially provides a bit of an overview as to what we're required to undertake as part of the strategy. We start with the capital costs, the growth-related capital needs. We make a series of reductions and discounts based on legislative requirements, very similar to the development charges study, such as benefit to existing shares, which are ineligible for recovery. We count for any sort of grants or other contributions, and that effectively leaves us with what is eligible for recovery, and that can be applied to units that are 5 or more stories with 10 or more residential units included. Next slide. A little bit on the implementation and administration. This will largely be likely your finance staff handling this once the bylaw is in place. But it's important for the Finance Committee and also Council to be made aware of these requirements. Consultation is required but not defined. So we are proposing to have a public meeting with respect to this bylaw in the coming months. Only one CBC bylaw is allowed. So we can't have multiple bylaws. You can certainly structure it for different areas of the town, but only one single bylaw can be implemented at any given time. We do have to provide a notice of bylaw passage, very similar to the DC requirements. And I mentioned that the funding tool is appealable to the tribunal. With respect to administration, the town will be establishing one single account for CBCs. Unlike development charges where we have a library reserve fund, a fire reserve fund, for all the different services, that's not the case for CBCs. You set up one, what they call a special account, and the funding of that account has to be either spent or allocated in each calendar year. So 60% of those funds have to be spent or allocated. It can be earmarked for certain projects. It can be earmarked against one project, depending on the significance of the cost. But that is something that will be dealt with likely through the treasurer's statement. That's what a lot of municipalities have started to do. The Development Charges Act now also requires us to commit or spend 60% of the money for water, wastewater, and roads. So very similar exercise to what's happening right now. The town also has to maintain a list of appraisers under agreement. There's dispute mechanisms for if a developer doesn't agree with what their land valuation is, very specific rules in the Planning Act for that. It's simply a list of appraisers that the municipality can go to say, we need to retain your services for an appraisal. I've spoken with the city of Niagara Falls, and I believe they're just starting to do this year. They have had their CBC bylaw in place, so I'm happy to share that information with town staff as well in order to assist with that. We also have to produce an annual report, very similar to a treasurer's statement for the purposes of the DCs, showing the opening and closing balances and the transactions. Next slide. So the strategy that we prepare as part of this work has to include a few key things. So we have to include a forecast. We must include a capital program, which relates to the increase in need for services arising from the future development. We have to identify what those facilities, services, and matters are to be funded from the CBCs. And we have to identify any sort of excess capacity, benefit to existing shares, or other adjustments. Next slide. So with respect to the forecast that we've prepared, we've largely relied on data from planning staff with respect to the development pipeline. So there's quite a few developments in the pipeline right now for the town. Recognizing that the majority of the greenfield land is built out, we are looking at a number of high-rise developments occurring or higher density developments occurring over the next 10 years. So once again, using our CPC threshold of 5 or more stories with 10 or more residential units, we're actually estimating about 2,500 CBC eligible units to be constructed in the next 10 years, assuming all of the development pipeline data that the town currently has continues on its path. And we recognize right now there's a lot of pressure to build housing in Ontario, specifically with housing pledges and a lot of the funding that's been made available. So I appreciate that this forecast might be a bit aggressive, but it is based on what the town has in their pipeline at this moment. So those 2,500 units, we actually anticipate about 3,100 to be built in the next 10 years. So that's about 80% of all units constructed will effectively pay a CBC rate once the bylaw is implemented. Next slide. I talked a little bit about this already, so we won't spend too much time, but the strategy, the capital program we've prepared is very similar to the development charges background study. You'll see the list of services. You'll also see a description of works, timing, and project costs. We certainly have identified different categories of projects for the purposes of the strategy, and that will allow the town with some flexibility as well in the future should some of the items that we've identified change, recognizing that the bylaw doesn't expire, so we're not necessarily set in stone on this matter. On the projects we've identified in the strategy, that can be amended and changed as part of your annual capital budgeting process. Next slide. I appreciate there's a lot of numbers on this slide, so I'll provide an example of one of the services, and then I'll talk about how we arrived at the totals for the purposes of this exercise. So as I mentioned earlier on in the presentation, we've identified a number of services through discussions with staff. I'll pick on growth-related studies because it's at the top of the PowerPoint presentation, but we've identified about $1.3 million in study costs for the purposes of the CBC strategy. About 10% of those costs we're saying are a benefit to existing share ineligible and cannot be funded from CBCs or DCs. Some of the projects we've identified in the CBC strategy do overlap with projects in the town's current DC background study, so we can't double count. So effectively, we net out the shares of projects that are funded from development charges, so that way we're not effectively double dipping between CBCs and DCs, because that would offend the legislation. What we look at in terms of the forecast is the amount of development that is related to CBC eligible units that meets that nexus test requirement. So our total eligible share is about 60,000 or 600,000 rather. And so the other funding of about 440,000 that we've identified, that will have to come from other revenue sources that could potentially be re-examined as part of the subsequent update of the town's DC background study. It's not to say that you can use other revenue sources to necessarily collect for that those shares of those projects, but what it means is that we can't collect everything through the CBCs. And so with all of the projects we've identified, we almost have $93 million in projects that we've identified in the next 10 years based on all these services. And so of that amount, we're saying about 47 million of it is related to CBCs or CBC eligible development. So if we go to the next slide, I chatted a bit about the rate structure at the beginning of the presentation. So there is no requirement to use the 4% of land value. However, we have found that that maximizes the recovery for CBCs. When you set it at a per unit basis, you have to average the land values out across the municipality. And using 4% of the land value for each particular development does reflect the unique zoning permissions and height density permissions of the site, which has a direct correlation with land values, which is why we're recommending that approach for the town. So next slide. So what we've done is a sensitivity test of using 4% of the land value. We have looked at land values from some of the other municipalities in the area, recognizing that we don't have a lot of information right now for the town on current appraisal. So we've done a bit of an average. So on average, the land value per unit is about just shy of 38,000. If we were to apply the 4% cap, that leads us to an average CBC rate of $1,500 per unit. With us projecting about 2,500 units in the next 10 years being eligible for CBCs, that would result in about $3.8 million in revenue for the town. So if we go to the next slide, this is where I made the comment that some municipalities have been a bit disappointed about how much revenues the CBCs can generate. Our eligible cost for recovery for CBCs is almost 47 million, but our forecasted revenue is just shy of 4 million. So a significant gap, but we're demonstrating through this exercise that the town will not offend the 4% of land value cap because the CBC program is so much larger than what the 4% of land value would be on average. So that's how we effectively demonstrate that the 4% of the land value is the rate that is applied for the purposes of CBCs. Next slide. A little bit of context to what other places are doing. As I mentioned, most do not have a land value per unit. So if you see the unit structure saying 4% of land value and then the per unit CBC forecasted revenue, that is an average amount. It's not saying that you come to the counter and you pay $1,200 a unit in Brampton. That's just their average. So you can see here we've calculated an average for Grimsby at about $1,500 per unit. Very similar to some of the other other rates we've calculated. Fort Erie, for example, was just shy of $1,500 as well. Niagara Falls is in the $1,600 to $2,000 range. Other places, such as the City of Toronto, obviously theirs is much higher, recognizing the height and density they have there, almost $6,000 per unit. So certainly a number of municipalities have brought forward CBC bylaws in recent years. And the overwhelming majority, as I mentioned, are basing them based on 4% of land value for the purposes of the rate structure. Next slide. So just to wrap up the presentation with next steps, we're here before you today to present the preliminary strategy and our preliminary findings. We are proposing to have consultation with the development industry and the public. That will happen in May and June. We also are going to be bringing forward the draft strategy to council at the end of May for their review and consideration as well. Shortly after that meeting, we will be then releasing the strategy publicly. The public will also be able to see the draft that we provide to council. However, we'll do a formal release along with the bylaw shortly after that. The passage of the bylaw is anticipated for early July. We're currently targeting July 2nd. And then after the bylaw is passed, we enter into a 40-day statutory appeal period. And if we go to the next slide, that wraps up the presentation. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much for that. I'm sure some of our members have questions here, and I will start with Councillor Vardy.
Thank you, through the chair. So you're saying that 60% of the CBCs, what was that what they're called now, CBCs? So 60% has to be spent in that calendar year. Spent or committed? And the reason I ask this is because we're going to have a lot of building down by the waterfront, high density buildings, so that would qualify. There is some talk that this could necessitate that maybe we need a third fire station. We might not have enough money to build with 60% a third fire station. It might, or maybe we would have enough money, but we couldn't spend it all in 1 year. So is it that it has to be committed? And once again, I always get confused because I know when we have a project, we have to commit for the whole price of the project in that year, as opposed to committing amounts in different years. So if a building permit, and I'm not quite sure how the building permits work, so when we get, these, 11 or 12 buildings that are supposed to go up in one of the developments, are they going to give us the money for all of it right away, or just as they build it? I mean, I'm just wondering, is this going to hamstring us in a way that we've got to spend this 60% in the calendar year, when we might have to make for big purchases to accommodate growth?
It's a great question, and through the chair. So I apologize if I misspoke. It is spend or allocate. The legislation is very clear to that effect. So let's say, as an example, the town had $1 million in the CBC reserve. 600,000 of that has to be either spent or committed to particular projects in a calendar year. It could be spread out across a number of projects. It could be committed to one singular project, but certainly the town is not under any obligation to spend that money in that year. It's just 60% of what sits in that balance. So let's say the town was saving up for a project. We didn't have enough money to fund that project until year 5. Every year when the treasurer's statement was issued, it would show 60% of the reserve balance being committed likely against that project. If that project wasn't tendered yet, or we didn't have the exact amount, and it was fully committed, and we still had another 10% committed to commit, we would then identify another project. It wouldn't necessarily fund the entirety of another project, but basically it's an ongoing exercise that happens every single year. Once you have enough money to fund a project in the reserve fund, you can go ahead and do that.
So then we do have the flexibility to kind of save up for something. Okay, thank you.
I just wanted to add that you're sounding like an accountant, committed or spent, like she's using all the right words. Thank you. I think Councillor Howe had his hand up next.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. The 4%, and I'm kind of baffled with this, where it's based on land value. So if the land is worth valued more, you're going to get more. Yet from a municipal standpoint, it's going to cost us just about the same amount to put the infrastructure in place that we're responsible for. Does that mean that, I'm going to say Toronto, we picked that one out. They're making money off of it, and the smaller municipalities, based on that, are not going to get ahead as such, based on what they have to do for their own infrastructure?
Yes, through the chair. It's an excellent question. So I would actually suggest that as higher density is permitted in a municipality, there's also additional pressures that happen on the infrastructure needs that surround that development. So as an example, a municipality may say, we're permitting 100 units on this lot. As a result of that, we need a 200 millimeter diameter pipe. Let's say the zoning has changed, and now those 100 units become 400 units, and now that pipe has to be 400 millimeters. Then we're able to effectively collect more money because there's additional density permitted on that site, which increases the land value. But on the other hand, there's likely additional infrastructure costs that the town is also incurring. So it's intended to provide that check and balance against, as land values go up with heightened density, infrastructure needs are also likely going up. As we saw in the presentation, though, that gap is still there. We're never going to collect all the money we need in order to fund the infrastructure using the 4%.
Another question, please, Chair. The on the one graph where it shows draft CBC capital programs, I think, and I'm nitpicking here probably, bridges, roads, and active transportation. Now, what about a pedestrian bridge across the QE? Where does that come into play? Is that in there? Is that active transportation?
Yes, through the chair. Excellent question. Active transportation would certainly include bridges over the QEW or any sort of bridge infrastructure. Yes, certainly.
And the last nitpicky one, public art, heritage, culture, and community infrastructure. And full disclosure, I'm on the library board. Does that include the library, or are they breaking up to, let's say, the cultural or softer side of services?
Yes, through the chair. So when we developed the CBC strategy capital program, we did have discussions with library staff on their capital infrastructure needs. Through the DC study, all of the infrastructure that was identified was able to be funded through development charges. So we didn't identify additional projects that needed to be funded through the CBCs. Certainly, though, the way in which we envision that category of service could include libraries should the DCs fall short in terms of the available funding. And if council so chooses to prioritize the funding of, say, a new library facility, that option would be there.
Just one follow-up though on the library. But if the library, then as we see the increased population over on that side, on the west side, there's going to be pressures on the library system, and we've discussed it, as to how are we going to service, and I'm being personal when I say library, fund those or that requirement or that pressure. At that point in time, could it go into the CBCs?
Yes, through the chair. So certainly our advice to our clients regarding the CBCs is to maximize your DC funding first, because we're not capped at the 4% of land value. So in the example you just gave, I would certainly suggest that the DC study should be examined first to see if we can maximize the development charges, because that will allow you to collect additional or more revenue than, say, if we were to put it in the CBC. But if the DCs were maximized and there were still library costs to be funded, it could certainly be added to the CBCs.
Any other questions from the members? Then if I may take the time to ask a few questions. So we're talking about 4% of land value. Are we talking raw land? Are we talking full developed land here? Can you just define that for us a little bit more?
Yes, and I apologize if I skimmed over that too quickly at the beginning of the presentation, because it's a very important point. The land valuation, or the value of the land, is intended to reflect the day before the first permit is issued. So all the planning permissions would be in place at that point in time. So essentially, it would reflect the value of the land based on the height and density of that particular site.
Thank you. That helps a lot. My next question is, we've listed all the potential service categories that could go in there. It sounds like the more we can add in, the better. But we also have to, I guess, be somewhat realistic based upon the projects we see coming at us. So what if we don't do something, though, that we have on the potential list? Like, what if we perhaps had some parking services we were contemplating doing, but as time goes on, in another few years, we decide, well, we've changed our mind and that's not going to be on our list anymore, on our priorities. How does that impact the calculation?
Yes, Chair, it's a great question. So certainly there isn't any consequence through the legislation if you so choose not to fund a particular category of service through the CBCs. It really is a flexible revenue tool for municipalities to use, and you can choose to apply it to any of the projects that we've established through the strategy. There should be consideration, however, if you choose not to spend CBCs on something in terms of, well, are there other revenue sources we could look at in order to fund that infrastructure? So parking, for example, we do have parking rates we could rely on. There's cash in lieu of parking bylaws that are being explored through municipalities. So certainly that can be looked at. The requirement of the legislation as well to do the review of the strategy every 5 years also provides that opportunity to say, you know what, this service is no longer a CBC priority. We're going to make it fall off the list, but we have service X, Y, and Z that we've identified instead. The reason why we also recommend doing that in tandem with the DC study is because, as I mentioned, we want to maximize the DC funding, and that provides that opportunity to do that, the two funding tools in tandem with each other to make sure that everything aligns nicely.
Thank you. And then if I will let the members speak after if I could ask just one more question. So typically, you know, we have to pass the bylaw. It goes into effect as of the day of passage. What happens to any projects that are, any development projects that I'll say are in process at that time? Where's the cutoff on this as to when a project now is subject to it and when it is not? Can you just help define that?
Yes, certainly. And we have explored a few different projects that the town currently is processing with respect to. Some of them fall under the old Section 37 rules still, and they have applications. So certainly once the bylaw is in place, if a building permit comes forward, that would be the trigger point for the CBC, so long as they meet those qualifications. Unlike the DCs, where it gets quite complicated, where we have to freeze things at site plan or rezoning, we don't have that same requirement here for the CBCs because it moves based on the 4% of the land value. So long as we have the bylaw in place and an application comes in for a permit, you can levy the CBC.
Thank you. Member Scandinavo.
Thank you, through you, Chair. Quick question. You spoke a lot about the 4% of the land value being the most common, but you know, I think Councillor Howe brought up a good point to say that what I think you were trying to say is that if land value in Toronto, you're building, you know, the same number of units on the same size piece of land, and, you know, you have to increase the let's call it plus or minus the same amount of services. That land value in Toronto is much higher, right? That 4% means a lot more money to the city of Toronto. However, they really have to sort of replace or increase or augment the infrastructure plus or minus the same way. So would it make more sense then, or perhaps you've done the work on this, or maybe you can help educate us, why the per unit, per square foot, or per net developable hectare is not something that we should consider in a place like Grimsby?
Yes, through the chair, that's a great question. For example, if we were to set a CBC rate at a per unit threshold, we would have to take an average and effectively say, okay, on average, we would expect a unit to pay $1,500 each. Where things get complicated is that the legislation says you cannot pay more than 4% of the land value. So that average that we have to establish per unit has to be done in a way that considers that 4% cap. And if we hit that cap, a developer has rights through the Planning Act to say, I dispute my charge. And so effectively, by setting a per unit rate, you're always under collecting, because we can never ensure that the 4% is maximized, because we have to set an average of the land value. And then for the developments that offend that 4%, they get a lower rate. So it's a bit of a dog's breakfast. In Innisfil, what we did was they have the Orbit development with very significant height and density permissions around the GO station. And so the land value for those particular sites would be much higher than the remainder of the town. However, we cautioned is that we would be, once again, having to apply this rule of averages, and some developments would be paying less than the 4%. And as a result of using that average. And that's actually been appealed to the tribunal at this time. So we're not sure what will happen. It might revert to the 4% of land value.
Do you have another question? Any other questions?
Well, I suppose just to follow on, so in a nutshell, 4% is the cap. So the other three criteria are effectively, nothing, right? Or are you saying that you could, however, upon appeal, it'll likely be overturned?
Yes, through the chair. So unfortunately, a per unit charge, unfortunately or fortunately, has not been adjudicated before the tribunal. So we don't have a decision with respect to that. But what it does, the pros of it is that it provides certainty to the developer. So they can build in their pro formas $1,500 a unit. The challenge, though, however, is that how do we index that rate? Unlike the development charges, they have a prescribed index. It's very easy rules for everyone to follow. You can't dispute them. There is no land valuation index. So as soon as you set the per unit rate again, the municipality could be under collecting. I'm not saying it necessarily would be appealed, because I think it would be a good news story to some developers, but I think the challenge would be that 4% cap stands no matter what we do through the bylaw.
Thank you. Councillor Howe?
Thank you, through you, Chair. And a question and I will direct it to the Finance Department. Do you expect that this is going to increase a workload over and above the DC, which we've been handling? Is it going to be any more, any less? Is it going to put additional pressures on the Finance Department?
Is it on now? Okay, sorry. Thank you. Through the chair, and I would say no, that's not anticipated to be the case. And it sounds like future studies such as CBC's could actually be funded from the CBC reserve as well, so we could use that money to fund expenses related to that.
Are there any other questions by the committee members? It looks like not. Thank you very much, Ms. Hall, for attending this evening. At this point in time, then, we would like to have a resolution that the presentation from Hemson be received. If I could have someone move that. That would be Member Thompson. Councillor Howe has seconded that. Then resolved that the presentation from Hemson be received. All those in favor? That is carried. Thank you. The next item on the agenda is item 7, and we have within that item reports 7.1 and 7.2. They've been classified as consent reports unless anyone would like them lifted and has questions or would like to discuss them. I'm not seeing any questions or anything. So at that point in time, typically we just have a resolution, unless someone would like our finance director to walk us through them, but I'm still not seeing any hands up. Member Scandinavo? Would you like one of them lifted? Otherwise, we'll just roll through to the resolution unless you have some questions about it, in which case we just need you to say you would like to have it lifted.
Yeah, I'd like to have it lifted. I think it's year-end results. I'm just trying to find the report name. Yeah, the year-end results and transfer to reserves. I just had a question about the appendix, but.
If you want to shut your mic. So that would be 7.1, Finance 24-11. And we'll just wait for you to find the specific question, would you like, or is it just a general question? Okay, so the clerk has advised me that we will first ask for a mover and seconder to approve Report 24-12, seeing no one has asked for that to be lifted. And then we will come back to the Report 24-11 that our member has questions on. So do I have a mover and a seconder to approve Finance Report 24-12? Councillor Howe and Member Thompson have moved and seconded that. So, oh, pardon me, yes, you are. Thank you. Then I need someone else to second that. Member Scandinavo will second that. So resolved that the Finance Committee approves the following item and the following consent items be approved with the recommendations contained therein. Finance Report 24-12. All those in favor by raising your hands, please. And that is carried. Then we will now move on to item 7.1, which is Finance Report 24-11. And Member Scandinavo has indicated he has some questions on that one, so I will give you an opportunity to ask.
Thanks. I don't think we need to walk through the report because it was done well and quite self-explanatory. But just as it relates to the Appendix A operating results by department, there's like a 380% variance in the taxation revenue and a 53,000% variance as it relates to that expense. I'm just curious. There's got to be a logical explanation for that. So.
And the page number?
It is page number 1 of 6, or 44 of 76, I should say.
Okay.
1 of 6 of the appendix.
Appendix
A.
I'll let you shut that off. So the specific question is on Appendix A, and that would be page 44 in Appendix A.
Thank you, and through the chair. When we are collecting taxes, we collect taxes on behalf of the school boards and the region, so you'll see the revenues being significantly higher, but you will also see the expenses being higher, because that is us actually distributing them out to the school board and the regions.
Through you, Chair, yeah, no, thank you. Figured that was the most logical explanation of that, but is there like a different way to show that or include it in the budget, or just so it doesn't like look like such a glaring variance? Or, sorry, it sounds a little nitpicky, but just curious.
No, thank you, through the chair. Honestly, I noticed that as well this year, and I'm not sure, I was thinking, was that there last year? So we can definitely look at that and exclude those accounts out.
Thank you. Any other questions from committee members? Did I have the right one? Appendix A, page 44?
Yes.
Okay. And so, Angela, that notation, do you want to just take that into account for next year when you're presenting it? Okay. Fair enough. Thank you. Then we will need to have a resolution to accept this report. So we need a mover and a seconder to put it on the table to accept this particular report. And that would be Member Thompson now. And a seconder for that, Councillor Vardy, thank you. So resolved that the Finance Committee hereby approves that Finance Report 24-11, 2023 year-end results and reserve transfers dated April 25th, 2024 be received, and that the 2023 surplus or deficit listed below be transferred to and from the reserves as outlined in Appendix C, and that would be $2,272,894 in the operational levy, a deficit or transfer out of $1,080,778 in wastewater, $268,868 in water, and $31,294 be transferred into the downtown improvement area. And that the $100,000 of the year-end surplus be approved as a budget amendment to fund the 24-25 Grimsby Community Development Grant Program. That was something that council had approved, that, I'll say that policy or philosophy when the budget was being drafted, that if we had a surplus, 100,000 would be allocated to this particular grant program. So we do have a mover and a seconder for that. Then I will call for the vote on that. All those in favor of that? And that is carried. Thank you. Then we will move on to item 8.2, which is Finance Report 24-13, which has to do with our 2024 tax rates and tax levy. Any questions? Would anybody like our treasurer to walk us through that, or? Councillor Howe?
Just the one number, that percentage is a little bit lower than what we kind of were happy with when we dealt with the budget, isn't it? So that's saying a 474, and that we were about 494 at budget time. Good accounting.
Angela, do you want to answer that?
Thank you, through the chair. When we're doing some of the calculations, there's some estimating and some rounding there as well, but it was quite significantly close, so that we were happy with that number. Thank you.
Are there any other questions from committee members about that? Then I would ask for a mover and a seconder to approve this report, but before I call for the vote, if I could have someone move and second that. Councillor Vardy, would you move that? Member Scandinavo will second that. So resolve that report from Finance 24-13 on the 2024 tax levy and tax rates dated April 25th, 2024 be received, that the Finance Committee recommends to Council to approve the following recommendations. bear with me, folks, there's quite a few, that the 2024 tax ratios and subclass reductions as outlined in Schedule A be adopted in accordance with Regional Bylaw 24-19, that the Town of Grimsby general tax rates as outlined in Schedule B be approved, that the Region of Niagara general tax rates as outlined in Schedule C be adopted in accordance with the Regional Bylaw 2024-18, that the Region of Niagara waste management tax rates as outlined in Schedule D be adopted in accordance with Regional Bylaw 2024-18, that the Region of Niagara transit tax rates as outlined in Schedule E be adopted in accordance with Regional Bylaw 2024-18, that the education tax rates as outlined in Schedule F be adopted in accordance with Ontario Regulation 400/98, that the Town of Grimsby wastewater rates as outlined in Schedule G be approved, that the Grimsby Downtown Improvement Area rates as outlined in Schedule H be approved. And perhaps I should just back up. I believe their official name now is the Grimsby Downtown Business Improvement Area, if that makes a difference too. Just a wording difference there. They did approve the change in their name in the last month. And that the 2024 tax rates and tax levy bylaw be prepared and the information outlined in Schedule A through H be included in the bylaw. All those in favor by a show of hands, please. Thank you, that is carried. Then we will move on to item 9, which is correspondence, and I think this is also almost going to become a standing item for this committee. We're calling it correspondence, but it's a staff memorandum on the, that we will be getting on a regular basis on the Peach King Center expansion. If I could have a mover and a seconder to get it on the floor, and then I'll ask if anybody has questions. So Councillor Vardy and Member Scandinavo have their hands up to move and second that. Does anyone have any questions on that report? Councillor Howe.
Thank you, through you, Chair. Angela, the one line item, miscellaneous costs and contingency. I have no problem with contingency, completely aware of that. But it's lumped into one. Is there a rationale for that? Or I've never seen a contingency line lumped in with something else. That's all.
Thank you, through you. I can't speak 100% onto the rationale as to why it was grouped that way, but I could say when going to market, I think there's something to say about addressing, including contingencies in cost estimates and trying to be competitive. So I think that's being identified separately just to remain competitive when we're going to the market.
I guess a question for anybody, or perhaps to Councillor Howe. Are you thinking miscellaneous costs and contingencies could be broken out on two different lines? Is that where your thinking was?
I've always kind of worked under the premise that the contingency usually comes into play at the last, whereas if you've got inflationary problems or adjustments you have to make for the costing of materials and labor, whatever the hard costs are. You know, to me, it lines out to two different things. Contingencies at a different point in time. That's all.
Thank you, through the chair. One of the discussions we had with the team was tracking that, so we know where those dollars are by rolling it in. We kind of lose sight. So it's actually a method of tracking that change and where it's going.
Are there any other questions from any other members? Some of the rest of our committee members have certainly dealt with capital projects of this size, so Member Scandinavo.
I just had a quick question, and Angela, I think you confirmed this last time, that line item hard costs like construction materials, leasing and equipment, as like the project on, like a lot of those are unknown at this point in time. Like this is just a budget. We still don't have actual, like, you know, firm quotes from contractors, right? If I've understood that correctly? Okay. Because I guess presumably, and where I'm going with this question is that as that rolls out, we're going to get expanded reports, right? So we can track on a more, line by line item, maybe not, explicit, but a little more detail on, perhaps where we're over or under, right? Because the devil's in the detail when you look at one line item that's $30 million. Well, if it's over or under by 3 million, well, it could be a bunch of stuff or one item. And anyways, I think I answered my own question.
If I can just summarize, and I do hear what you're saying too, is that when we look at that chart, of course, the biggest line item within all of that, the 36 million that's forecast, is 30 million, that number on hard costs. And of course, we've had a question now on a line item that's 3 million. So if we're really going to deal with material items on here, it's obviously the hard cost number of 30 million. And I guess we're assuming that within that you have, or you will have, more detail as time goes on. So if I can paraphrase the question from Member Scandinavo, are you thinking that maybe as we get deeper into the project, you'd like to see some subcategories underneath that, tracking it? Is that what you're thinking, rather than just dealing with one line at $30 million?
Yeah, absolutely. So as the project unfolds and those hard costs, we're getting more firm quotes on those. I'd like to see that line item broken down so we can actually look at, what makes up that 30 million, and is that particular line item on target or not, right? Because if there's going to be some overage or underspend, where is it, and how are we going to address that particular item? So yes.
To our treasurer, would you like to add some thoughts to that?
Sure, yeah, I think that makes total sense, and as the project advances, I think that would make more sense. I'm sure that's something that we could take back and for further reports. Yeah.
Any other questions? Councillor Howe.
If I can, just, or as a comment maybe for committee, in talking with community services staff, I believe it's 3 of the big packages are going out. The mechanical is going out, the steel is going out. So we're going to see some real numbers coming, make a bit of a difference, but the big numbers.
Yes, in fact, in the report on page 3, it gives us the details on tender package 2, civil and structure coming mid-May, and then tender package 3 on the base building mid-June, and then the next one July. So yes, we will really be getting some firm numbers, and so maybe it would help if the project has costs allocated to that, once the tenders come in, then to be able to track that. I'm not so sure that it's good to disclose that to the suppliers before they bid on it as to what our breakdown is. Sometimes it helps to hold things close to our chest until people bid on it, right? Rather than show them what the cards are in our hand. But perhaps as each one comes out and it's decided on, then we could have a breakdown of what the budget was compared to what the tender is coming in at. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so I will still ask that the staff memorandum on the Peach King Center expansion be received, perhaps with the recommendations or the comments as discussed. I realize that sounds very vague, but I think we know what it means. Councillor Vardy? She's putting up her hand to vote.
Yes.
All those in favor, please. Thank you, that is carried. Then a few other items still on our agenda tonight. Item 10.1, Councillor Charrois has resigned from the Finance Committee, and so I do need a mover and seconder to accept the councillor's resignation. Councillor Vardy is moving that. Councillor Howe is seconding that. All those in favor, please. That is carried. The second item is 10.2, which has to do with transit ridership. And if we could just give you a bit of background. So there was a request at the last Finance Committee to ask the Niagara Regional Transit Commission for some more information by our member who has now resigned. At the same time, that request was also made at the council level, and we did receive that information, and it did come to Corporate Services to the April 2nd, 2024 meeting. So I just wanted to share that with the committee. We decided that really we weren't going to bring it back to this committee again. It's kind of hit other committees and council. But if you are interested in reading about it, just for your own information, I would recommend you go to the April 2nd, 2024 Corporate Services Committee agenda, and it is attached as a report to that committee meeting. Under correspondence? Okay. Under correspondence to help you narrow it down. Is there any other business that anyone would like to bring to the committee?
I actually just want to comment, because my hand wasn't up much tonight, just because of the reports, how thorough, and they were excellent. They were very well done, and it made the night go very easy for all of us, I believe. And I look forward to the wastewater going away off my taxes, and we're all going to one. That's going to be great. You communicated very well to the public, in my opinion. It's unfortunate about the water and that. I thought it got out very well through flyers to everything. I did hear a lot of feedback, even from some of the seniors in our community, my in-laws that live in town. But unfortunately, it just didn't hit them well. And now the new communication person coming on board is going to make it even better for us. But I think you did a great job. And thank you for all your hard work, everybody.
Yes, thank you. Acknowledging that Lisa Martin came to our meeting tonight, prepared to answer some questions on that. Yeah, that was a complex report to get into in the analysis, so thank you to everyone. If I could just ask one question, and perhaps I should have done it under business arising, but at the March meeting, at last month's meeting, we talked about reviewing the investment policy and then meeting the investment advisor. Do we have dates when we're thinking that might be happening on our work schedule, or an approximation as to when it'll come back to us?
Yes, I believe we have the investment advisor coming to committee next month in May for a presentation. Is that right?
Sounds good. And at that time, the investment policy too, do you want to share that, or did it come out already? Sorry, I'm really fuzzy on this point right now. I'll let one of the two of you answer that.
Yeah, so there's no date set yet for the policy, but I think once we have a discussion with the investment advisor, then likely in the summer or the fall would be good timing for that.
That sounds good. So we'll have hopefully a guest in May. Any other comments, questions before we close the meeting? No. Then this meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone.